"Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything, so your father's decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it? Just because it's smaller than the others?" Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outside. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know a lot more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's so unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing. A runty little pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. An odd look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back to the house, and I'll bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you start it on a bottle, like a baby." This is the opening scene of Charlotte's Web, the beloved 1952 children's book by E.B. White that tells the story of a friendship between a pig named Wilbur and a spider named Charlotte. Soon after it was published, reviewer Eudora Welty wrote in the New York Times Book Review that it was a book about, quote, "friendship on earth, affection and protection, adventure and miracle, life and death, trust and treachery, pleasure and pain, and the passing of time." A year has passed now since the pandemic began. A year of life and death, trust and treachery, pleasure and pain. In that year, we've lost so much. Connections, love, time with one another, life we planned to mark differently at graduations and births and anniversaries. The worst of it, though, has been death's visitation. The unconscionable, unfathomable nearly 3 million deaths from the disease, as well as the non-COVID deaths that have taken place during this time without the rituals of gathering and mourning that we need as human beings. The Christian story of Easter that we mark this Sunday is a ritual retelling of a story about the human experience of death and the perpetual hope for resurrection. It's a pathway for people to make sense of one of the most painful aspects of being human, our mortality. In Charlotte's Web, after Fern saves the little pig from slaughter, a spider named Charlotte also has to save him from another, different untimely death. The book follows the story of their friendship and Charlotte's work to help Wilbur the pig become a prize-winning fair pig and thereby prevent him from becoming bacon. Then, despite her good life, well lived, and her heroic work to save the life of her friend, the book culminates with Charlotte facing her own death at the end of the season. It's a lot of death for a children's book. And while the characters manage to prevent violent and early death for Wilbur, they can't stop the natural life cycle and death of Charlotte. According to Michael Sims, in the 2011 book he wrote, The Story of Charlotte's Web, E.B. White actually faced pressure from the publishing company to remove Charlotte's death from the book because they were worried it was too difficult for children to handle. But the publisher's fears about children's ability to understand and deal with death were not borne out by the book's young readers. In a review in the New Yorker right after the book came out, Kincaid wrote of a 10-year-old boy's response to it. After a period of unusual silence in his room, broken by occasional loud laughs, he emerged with his face drawn, but under rigid control. "It's terrible to say goodbye to Charlotte," he said. When I read Charlotte's Web in grade school, I remember weeping at the end of the book when Charlotte died. This wasn't because I couldn't handle Charlotte's death, however. It was because I understood it. Through that book, I understood the tender tragedy that death is a part of life. And while it's inevitable, it's also, as the little boy said, terrible. It was a holy and sacred introduction to this truth. Ultimately, E.B. White held his ground with the publishers, insisting that children are capable of understanding death. Indeed, White hoped his novel would help children understand how death is woven into the fabric of life, and that by understanding death better, they might better understanding the fullness of life, its tenderness and its tragedy, its trust and its treachery, its pleasure and its pain. I imagine he helped some adults understand this more clearly as well. We are still in the midst of the pandemic. Even though we might be beginning to see the tendrils of hope floating up at the edges of the eastern horizon, we're not yet at shining dawn. This time that we're living in is the Easter story's time of the empty tomb, when the stone has been rolled away and we look in to find the tomb empty. We do not know what has happened. We do not know what comes next. The pain of loss, the reality of death's sting is still deeply with us. Even if we believe dawn is coming, there's no denying the pain of what we've been through. After the story of Charlotte's Web was published, author Michael Sims did an interview on NPR where he recounted how when E.B. White was recording the 1970 audiobook version of Charlotte's Web, quote, "Every time he broke down when he got to Charlotte's death, the producer took him to walk outside, and E.B. White would go and say, 'This is ridiculous. A grown man crying over the death of an imaginary insect.' And then he would go in to record and start crying again when he got to that moment. He took 17 takes to get through Charlotte's death without his voice cracking or beginning to cry. There is no fixing or saving us from the reality of our mortality. There is no stopping the grief from the loss of our loved ones. We have been exposed by the losses of this year, and many of us come to this Easter Sunday raw and exhausted. While death is part of life, this year, death was brutal and unyielding in its sweep across the globe. Loss of loved ones and our own inevitable mortality mixed in this year with smaller and yet so often heart-rending losses of time and passion and connection and dreams. In the Easter story, as it's told in the book of John, it's Mary Magdalene who comes to the empty tomb first. She is wild with grief, and when she finds the tomb empty, she runs out to her community, crying out to them that they have taken the body of her beloved Jesus, and she doesn't know where they have put him. Other disciples run to the tomb to see what has happened, and they all have different reactions to its emptiness. In this time of the empty tomb, how do we react when we don't know what has happened? What do we assume? When we don't know what will come, what do we expect? We are too close to the pandemic. We are still in its midst to be able to fully see and understand its meaning yet. One of the reasons Unitarian Universalists struggle with the Easter story is because it's weird. But what if we approached the story not as a literal explanation of physical experience, not as supernatural, but rather as something weird, something mysterious or mystical or metaphorical? In the story, when Jesus returns to the disciples, he is unrecognizable to them. Disciple after disciple sees someone or something else when Jesus comes to them before they can see Jesus in that person. Before we can see or understand what will be resurrected or what will be born, what kind of unimaginable new life, unimaginable resurrection will happen after this pandemic, we have to travel through the valley of the shadow of death. We have to lose things, lose people, lose who we were before this, before the new life comes. When Mary enters the empty tomb, She assumes Jesus is a gardener, and she asks him where he has taken Jesus' body. But then Jesus calls her name. He says, Mary. And she sees him. She gasps and she cries, Teacher. But he tells her she cannot hold on to him, for he has to go. Her job is to tell the community he is risen. Becoming requires letting go of that which we love. Becoming requires releasing things we have loved deeply. It is terrible. It is devastating. And it is the truth of life. In this church, we may have to let go of some of the things we have loved deeply to become who we need to be after this. A church that serves people within our walls, but also beyond them, both in the community and virtually. Once we're able to safely gather again in person, and our COVID team is still working on a policy for when and how we'll be able to do that, they will communicate that policy with you just as soon as they have it, I promise. When we are able to safely gather again in person, we may need to let go of resistance to technology and worship so that we can bring a more dynamic experience to people who are joining us virtually, whether that be for health or safety or geographic reasons. We may have to let go of some of our borders, some of our attachment to how we do things, to become a church that serves people within and beyond our walls. I honestly don't know what we will become together. I don't know what life will look like for me, or for you, or for us, or for the world around us after the pandemic. But what I do know is that something new is being born. The story of spring, the story of Easter, the story of life, all tell another truth. Despite death, new life is continuously being born and is always on the rise. In Charlotte's Web, Charlotte dies right after giving birth to a new generation of baby spiders. E.B. White writes that in the barn with Wilbur, quote, Charlotte's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren year after year lived in the doorway. Each spring, there were new little spiders hatching out to take the place of the old. Most of them sailed away on their balloons, but always 2 or 3 stayed and set up life in the doorway. Dear ones, here we are, in the doorway. The stone has been rolled away and the tomb is empty. We do not know what will come next. It's mysterious. But I promise you this, new life is becoming right now. May we grieve what we have lost, and may we let go so that we might embrace that new life fully, celebrate it, and sing the miraculous song of hope Hallelujah. Life rises again. Amen. And may it be so.